There's something new from our sponsor, Text Control. For decades, TX Text Control's rendering was tied to Windows functionality. But now it's a new era. TX Text Control is platform independent. You can run your .NET applications on Windows or Linux, deploy with Docker containers, Kubernetes, or host directly in Azure App Services. Seamlessly integrate document editing, signing, collaboration, and PDF processing into your ASP.NET Core and Angular applications. Are you ready to see it in action? Check out the live demo at demos.textcontrol.com. That's demos.textcontrol.com. Hi, I'm Scott Hansel, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with Preeti Somal, the Senior VP of Engineering at Temporal Technologies. How are you?
I'm great, Scott. Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for spending time with me. You know, when I love talking about people's LinkedIns because I go to one's LinkedIn and you get a sense of who they are. It's more than a resume, it's a timeline. And it feels to me like you have been a cloud person since before we said cloud. You've been doing big systems for years.
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting. I was part of an organization back in 2013 that was called the Platforms Organization, long before platforms was a thing. So, yes, I've been doing this for longer than I would care to admit, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, you've worked at VMware, you worked at Yahoo, you worked at HashiCorp. When did the cloud, that concept of the cloud, like click for you? When did you, was it around 2013? Like how many years has it been now? 15 years? 10?
Actually, I would say 2008.
2008.
This was sort of early VMware days. And, um, the challenge back then was virtualization was like super well established. And one of the projects I led was a project called Lab Manager, which was, hey, how do developers get their virtual machines without needing to go through a ton of work? And so I think some of the patterns around self-serve, developer focus, things like that were already emerging back then.
So we are now 17, almost 18 years. We almost have an adult when we think about the cloud. But still, people are naively, and I hope that's an okay term to use, naively lift and shifting almost 2 decades in. Like that's what we did. We moved, for a time, the cloud was other people's computers. We would pick up a VM and we'd put it over there. But it would stay stateful. But then when we say cloud native, I think about that as being an application that knows that the cloud exists, and we think about state entirely differently. My first question is, why are people still naively lifting and shifting and not taking advantage of opportunities around how they manage state 2 decades into the cloud?
Great question. I'm not sure I have an answer for you, but it's certainly puzzling. And it's also, I think, what's so fascinating for me working at Temporal, because Temporal really is a solution to make sure that you are taking advantage of all of the capabilities. But you do have to rethink. You can't do a lift and shift. You have to really think about outsourcing all of your reliability, resiliency, sort of challenges over to Temporal.
Yeah. So the solution that Temporal provides is one of durability. It's sitting not just on top of cloud infrastructure and abstracting away that. It seems like it's even higher level. It's abstracting away common business problems. And one of the common problems is failures happen. That's a thing. And help me understand, what are the things that Temporal is hiding from me as an infrastructure person or as a developer?
Absolutely. So for those who may not know Temporal, our mission really is to shield developers from all of these complexities that come with managing state and building resilient applications, right? So we like to think about durability as, what if your code never fails? Now, we all know that code does fail, and what Temporal really does is makes that failure inconsequential. So a developer is essentially just focusing on building their business logic, And we are handling all of the retries, state management, all of the complexities around making sure these failures are inconsequential.
Mm-hmm. So if I had today, in the year of our Lord 2025, some virtual machine that is old and I'm shifting it into the cloud, what would I change in that maybe decade-old application for it to take advantage of Temporal if it was just a simple infrastructure as a service, lift and shift, versus maybe writing something with Temporal at the heart of it today, like a file new greenfield application?
That's a great question. Because as we know, for a lot of the software out there, greenfield isn't necessarily an immediate sort of option. So the way you would do this is for one of those old VMs was you would essentially wrap that VM into a temporal abstraction called an activity. And that's how you wrap anything that is sort of uh, failure prone into the temporal programming model. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it's a big hammer. You are kind of taking that whole VM and putting that into an activity. And so your recovery, the sort of granularity of your recovery will be equally sort of um, large in that, you're not going to be able to get more precise control over all of the logical steps of your application that need to be retried. And so if you were doing this greenfield, you would essentially just write your business logic. You would take the failure prone parts of the business logic, make them as granular as possible, wrap them in activities so that when a failure does occur, we can pick up with a lot more precision than with that big hammer approach.
There was a time, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, right around when the cloud was happening. I was doing things in DCOM and Corba, in RMI, for the older folks that may be listening. And we wrapped things in a transaction, and we would think about scope of a transaction. Is an event like a transaction, or is it even higher in scope, for lack of a better word? Is it a higher level construct?
Yeah, gosh, I hadn't heard those acronyms for a while,
I
but yes,
apologize
no worries,
immediately.
no worries. It's actually a little bit more granular because if you think about it, we would back then consider a transaction to be an atomic sort of unit, right? And we know now that these multi-step applications or multi-step flows, um, you need to do things like compensating for sort of the classic money transfer, where if some part of that goes wrong, you want to be able to compensate back. And so it's more granular than that. And one of the examples that I can give you is, for instance, one of our customers that has spoken at our conferences is Yum Brands, and they have modernized their entire order processing system using Temporal. And if you think about it from a, a consumer on a mobile app putting an order for tacos to that order making it to the kitchen to picking up the order, there's a lot of steps in there. And if you have to cancel the order, for instance, you have to go back and redo the loyalty points and refund the customer and so on. So Temporal really helps you outline all the various steps in your business flow and gives you that granularity where you can pick up at any point based on the failures that you might run into.
Now, what's interesting about that, and what for me as a cloud architect who has not worked on a project using Temporal, is that you promise for stateful workflows, even over months or years long, because like a business process could be one's doing their taxes, and it's a very long running workflow, or it could be a workflow that only runs for a couple of seconds, but it could be interrupted in the middle. There's the business logic that could be interrupted. There's the kind of middle layer of like a payment processor had a hiccup. But then there's also just a DNS error or a small step or a lookup fails. Those are really different layers, in the 7 layer stack. But Temporal your durable execution platform promises to basically handle all of those issues. How is that possible? Am I using different constructs? Are you hiding it from me, or am I calling your API in order to do that work?
Yeah, great question. So the way that Temporal works is you actually code your application to our SDKs. And as part of that, Temporal is managing the dispatching of tasks to your code. So you code it to our SDK. We have a concept of a worker. That's where your code is running, which actually runs in your infrastructure. And that's a really, really elegant part of our security model. And what Temporal, the server, is doing is essentially dispatching tasks, right? Think about the analogy of puppets and a puppet master. And so Temporal is really the puppet master, sort of controlling all of the tasks that are going on. And so when we see a failure, no matter what level it's at, we can tell the worker where in the task processing the failure occurred, and the developer has the ability to set things like retries, exponential backups, and kind of, how they want to sort of think about recovery, but they don't actually have to do that with a lot of the scaffolding in the code. It's a very elegant programming model that does all of that for them pretty seamlessly.
Hey, friends, we're going to take a moment and hear from our new sponsor, ShareGate at sharegate.com. I'm chatting with Shaylin Gimby. Shaylin, I've been thinking about moving my Google Suite over to M365, and, the migrations, they're like pulling teeth. What are the biggest headaches that IT teams will run into, and why does it take so long?
It's funny. I find that IT admins always think migrations seem really complicated, but truthfully, if you do the planning really well, it can be smooth sailing. It all starts with planning. You need to figure out the scope, set realistic timelines, and take inventory of permissions. If you don't do that up front, you're kind of setting yourself up for delays and potential security risks down the line. The reality is a lot of these migrations involve huge amounts of sensitive data. So rushing isn't an option. And then there's also the Microsoft side. Microsoft enforces some throttling limits to manage traffic, which can slow things down even more. That's where we come in. We help IT teams get ahead of those roadblocks with ready-made reports like our site report, lays out everything in your environment, or source analysis, which estimates how much effort your migration will actually take. And to get around throttling, well, our customers can utilize concurrent migrations with ShareGate Pro. It allows them to accelerate their migration.
Very cool. That is ShareGate by WorkLeap. It's one tool to migrate faster and secure your tenant. It's an out-of-the-box Microsoft 365 migration and governance tool that you can learn all about at sharegate.com. Thanks a lot for being a sponsor. This might be a silly question, but so far you've been very complimentary saying that my questions are good, so keep doing that. But this means that one really needs to understand their problem space in order to describe one of these workflows. Like, it seems like if I decided to write an app and I'm going to use Temporal, it's going to challenge me to really think about designing as if failure is inevitable. And if I don't understand my workflow, Temporal is going to basically force me to understand my workflow.
Absolutely. And the magic of all of this is that you really spend the bulk of your time understanding your workflow and your business logic versus actually writing all of that scaffolding around it. There's a lot of studies out there, and some studies will even go so far as saying that 50% of a developer's time is spent in kind of this error handling side of the house versus the core business logic side of the house. And so our goal with Temporal is, we just take all of that on and we free up the developer. And essentially, we want to drive to more agility and to get developers to really focus on their application and not have to worry about all of the sort of scaffolding around it.
That seems like the kind of promise of separation of concerns that we've always been told that the cloud would provide. I think people perhaps thought the cloud would provide it for free, But once you kind of acknowledge and accept that the Temporal SDK is available to you, then my question is, are you cloud agnostic and language agnostic? This works in any language, any cloud?
So we are, in terms of the language part, early on, we made a decision to really meet developers where they are. And so these SDKs I was referring to, we've built them as sort of idiomatic language SDKs. And again, our focus on that developer experience is really strong. We have a very high bar around it. And so we have SDKs in 6 different languages today. Um, and, for instance, what we want to be able to do is a developer that knows Python, we want them to be able to use Temporal without having to relearn something else and kind of in a Python native way, right? So again, we've got these idiomatic SDKs. On the cloud side, we run our data plane today in AWS and GCP, and we've got Azure on our roadmap, and we're working towards that. But what customers really sort of interact with is a logical construct of a namespace. This is where kind of the workflow orchestration happens. And they can decide what region and what cloud they want to put that namespace in. Most of the considerations there happen to be around their latency requirements, et cetera, versus sort of a cloud specific abstraction.
I like that you call out latency, because I feel like if I can call back to those references to like Corba and RMI and DCOM, they all gave the illusion of location transparency. You would just pretend that, oh yeah, it doesn't matter. There could be a local object, it could be remote. But then I think we all, as cloud architects, realize that the only thing that matters is latency. And when you're putting together a workflow, you really have to be conscious about how many milliseconds are we just throwing away to get this thing done. And if I'm calling into another region or calling in another continent, now we're talking about the speed of light. And customers will be gone in a half a second if we don't give them the need. It seems like Temporal doesn't. Does it take latency into consideration, or does it help me at all solve some of those problems?
Well, so the approach we took here is, just essentially recognizing that you can't abstract away latency, right? Sort of the speed of light, the physics around there. So
Right.
and that's the main reason that we give customers a choice around what region they want to create and build their namespace in. On the other hand, we also, because obviously we're in the runtime, we're in the kind of the data plane path of your application executing, because we're orchestrating all of these tasks. And so we have a very high bar around the latency at which we dispatch these tasks, right? So, and that's an SLO that we measure and we are looking at all the time, because we know that we are taking sort of some part of the customer experience end to end time here, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, there's the namespace that we talked about, but namespaces have a rate limit, and they measure it with what's called actions per second. And one of the hard things about computer science is naming stuff. And when you have these really wide open words like workflow, action, namespace, I think I would get a little bit of analysis paralysis. Like, what is an action? Is an action a user story? Is an action, I wrote a byte to the disk? What's the granularity of an action? Because, a default limit of a namespace in Temporal is 400 per second. And I don't necessarily know if that maps to a business's action.
Yeah, that's another great question. An action is essentially sort of a logical construct that we use to bundle all of the pieces of the workflow that gets charged for, gets rate limited, right? So, for instance, a start workflow event is an action, or, I am going to audit a specific event in the workflow, etc. Now, what's really interesting here, and has been sort of the conundrum around platforms, is how do we with the breadth of use cases running on a platform like Temporal, relating the logical constructs that Temporal provides to the business constructs that a developer is building against isn't necessarily straightforward, right? And so one of the examples I use in conversations in terms of the breadth of use cases is, on the one hand, we have something like Snap running on our platform, which is a consumer application. On the other hand, we have the Taco Bell order, and it's this conundrum around the platform. And so we've landed on actions as the logical construct, and we do our best to explain to users what this is. However, we find that the rate limits there, especially with cloud, that's where the value of cloud really comes in, right? Like the burst capacity pieces. By default, we have that 400 APS rate limit, but we do have something we call Planner that is always running and looking at how traffic is modulated and automatically increasing those rate limits over time. And so we have customers that are going into, like, the hundreds of thousands of actions per second as well.
Oh, wow. One of the things that I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but you must have really good support for open telemetry, because then I would get amazing metrics at the cloud architect level, and like how many HTTP retries are happening. And that could help me from a health perspective, but also at the business person's level, because they would be able to see telemetry around actions and workflows. And I should be able to answer questions for the business and answer questions for the cloud architects and the SREs.
Yes, we have a lot of metrics that we expose to customers, and yes, they are at all of those levels you were talking about. And then what we find customers doing is even taking like the workflow and actions level of metrics and translating them into like business metrics. So, for instance, the number of orders processed, how long did it take, etc. So customers are sort of building dashboards on top of the instrumentation and the telemetry that we provide them, because they understand how their business logic kind of maps back into that workflow. And so this takes us back to the point you were making earlier, that it really forces the developer to think about the workflow and, what pieces of that workflow are things that they want to sort of abstract out, reflect in terms of business metrics, etc.
There was a time, and this is a bit of a challenging question, I think, so don't take it wrong, but there was a time when people would say, well, I don't want vendor lock-in, and they would try to abstract away vendors. And I used to just say directly to customers, you're lying to yourself if you think that abstracting away from this SDK is going to provide you value. You're going to put a bunch of work into hiding all of our abstractions rather than just fully absorbing and accepting that you are now a blank application. I'm curious, when you're selling into a big business and you say, hey, you're going to become a temporal application, let's not try to hide all the temporal SDKs. Let's just embrace fully being a workflow, being an action, being a temporal application. Do customers still seem to believe in the illusion of avoiding vendor lock-in or avoiding the realities of accepting an SDK like this?
Yeah, we have that conversation, except it takes a slightly different sort of angle to it. And to explain that, it's important to understand that Temporal is an open source project. It is something where if a customer did not want to run on Temporal Cloud, they can run Temporal Server on their own infrastructure. And so the lock-in is to the programming model, this sort of concept of durable execution and workflows, and not to a vendor. Right?
That's a really great point.
Right. And another piece that's really important, and this is something we hold very, very dearly to everything we do, our commitment to our developer community is, if they write a workflow using the SDKs and they bring that to cloud, they can take that back to self-hosted without any code changes. And so that's how we sort of help customers get comfortable with that sort of vendor lock-in concern that they have. But you're absolutely right in the sense of the SDKs. You have to embrace the programming model. You have to see value in it. And, our goal really is customers need to kind of see that value for themselves. And honestly, one of the things that is very, very gratifying is when developers tell us that, once it clicks, there's no turning back. They kind of see workflows everywhere. And in fact, with everything happening in AI, it's been really interesting to see how, our sort of developers who know Temporal are seeing workflows in the AI applications that they're building as well.
So Temporal's been around for a while. It doesn't feel like it was made for agents, but then when agents happened, it's like, wow, Temporal is right there, ready to go. Like it was made for agents. Is that just a lucky coincidence?
Oh my God, such a lucky coincidence. I think the core of this is when you actually peel away all of the terminology, at the heart of it, you still need to orchestrate a multi-step process. And we just, Cornelia, who is a developer advocate in our DevRel team, just published a blog where basically we're taking the terminology that is becoming kind of the lingua franca, if there's such a thing, around the AI agents world, and showing how like these temporal constructs that have been around for some time are like production tested, kind of just map very, very seamlessly to those sort of concepts coming out of the AI agent world.
Yeah, it seems like it's the perfect moment for you all because you've got Kubernetes there, ready to go for container orchestration. Temporal is ready to go with durable workflow orchestration, long-running business logic, which isn't super easy on Kubernetes. You run very nicely on top of it. And then we've got all these agents that are going to be created over the next couple of years, many of which are going to be long-running. And the latency now is going to be on the LLM or on the customer and what they're being asked to do. It seems like it's the perfect storm for you all to jump in there.
Absolutely. And we're already seeing, a lot of sort of usage in that space. And, it's always really heartening to see that the platform that was built before AI agents was a thing, is able to deliver against all of the requirements in such an elegant way.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting that the thing that I think about when I was learning about temporal is error recovery. And the parallel that I'm drawing, which may not be an obvious one, is that LLMs are not deterministic. So they fail. And we have to design systems that fail. And since temporal was designed with the assumption that systems will fail, you could make things more reliable because error recovery in temporal means, do we retry? Do we escalate? Do we fall back? Or is it a human in the loop situation? Which is, I think, so important in building systems like this.
Absolutely. You're spot on. And in fact, we had this happen our user conference is called Replay, and we were doing the keynote demo, and it was an agent, and the LLM failed. And right there, we were able to kind of switch to a different vendor, right? And so you're absolutely right there that it's like incredibly applicable to the problems that we are seeing today in building agents.
Right. And then before agents existed, like last week, because things are moving so fast right now, context is so important in a long-running workflow, and maintaining state between steps fits nicely into a potentially long-running LLM experience. And you could have that context flow through temporal as well.
Yeah. I'm feeling like you could be a really strong dev advocate for us. No,
Well,
absolutely.
I appreciate that. I am non-denominational, but what I really like to do is understand problems. And I personally think that as a person of a certain age, I remember what it was like before the cloud. And there's value in understanding why the cloud exists. Like, what problem did it solve? So when I went to educate myself about temporal, I want to keep reminding myself what long running state engines existed, what long running state problems were people like, I don't know, like the Gang of Four. Like there were people doing long running state work in the 60s, and we're standing on the shoulders of giants in systems like Temporal.
Absolutely. And, that's something that we pay a lot of respect to, because when you look at even Temporal's founding story, it's not something that was like created last year. It sort of came out of a series of experiences that our two co-founders, Max Fatih and Samar Abbas, have had in and around the space that you were just talking about, right? Like early cloud, maturing cloud, time at Uber.
Mm-hmm.
These are lessons that they've learned, and on all of their sort of their focus on the developer experience and the core sort of element of durable execution has been incredibly strong. And that's where we stand today. We absolutely stand on the shoulders of so much incredible work that's happened over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. Your point about Temporal evolving out of the Uber Cadence project really speaks to the problem that was Uber, which was a long running, very problematic and very touchy process because there's humans interacting with other humans and they might not show up. Like there were probably in the early days of Uber many long running workflows that were failing for lots of different reasons, both cloud based and humans not being able to see each other across the street. And all of that are part of the foundational patterns that Temporal is going to have to build upon.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the fun examples that I hear about from the Uber Cadence days was apparently the loyalty program was also modeled as a workflow. And if you think about it, that is sort of the life of the subscriber as a workflow that is incredibly long running. And so that's the power of the platform that's evolved over so many years.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been so interesting. I mean, really learning about Temporal's architecture for me, I love history of computer science. I love understanding that this architecture is like the modern embodiment of ideas from Leslie Lamport for distributed consensus, or Barbara Liskov doing reliability and distributed computing, and having that available open source, self-hosted, or in the Temporal cloud. Everybody wins. I really appreciate you spending time with me today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
We've been chatting with Preeti Somal, Senior Vice President of Engineering at Temporal Technologies. You can check out Temporal at temporal.io. Go learn about how it works, check out the platform, the pricing, and check out GitHub, because it's an open source project that you can go and explore on github.com. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.